And that one big problem that I want to do with you is problem 23-4A. And this is on page 905 in your text. So 23-4A, we're looking at page 904 and 905. So it starts on 904. We have Trico Company to the following standard unit cost for its single product. We have the predetermined overhead rate that's based on a planned operating volume of 80% of the productive capacity of 60,000 units per quarter. And we have the flexible budget information available. During the quarter, the company operated at 90% of capacity and produced 45,000 units of product. I want you to underline that 90% of capacity and produced 54,000 units of product. I want to pause right there for a second because I'm pulling out what you need in order to do this problem. See in the table right above the sentence we just read, this is a flexible budget based on different operating levels. I know it's giving me all this good stuff. I don't need all that good stuff. All I need is the 90%. So circle the 90% column. And I know that because the company operated at a capacity of 90%. So all that extra information is just extra information. Now let's keep reading. The actual direct labor totaled 265,000 hours. So underline that as well. And then units produced were assigned the following standard costs. So those are my standards. I need that stuff right there. And then in the next sentence, actual costs incurred during the quarter follow, and I need that table too. Those are my actual costs. So we are going to find our materials variances, our labor variances, and our overhead variances. So to save time, I'm going to leave my table up here. And we're going to fill in what is missing, starting with materials. Okay, so for materials, my starting point is to fill in my table. So for materials, I need my actual price. And if you look in the second table, second green table on page 905, that shows me my actual costs incurred. And I see that my actual price was $4.10 per pound. So I fill in that 410. My actual quantity is also there, 1,615,000. Now, for my standard price for materials, we see, and we can go back to page, where page is it on? Page 904, where it shows me my materials in terms of the standard unit cost. I can find this in two places, but I really want to find it using that first green table of the problem on page 904. So the standard for materials is not 120. X that out. I need the cost per pound, and it's 4. So my standard price is 4. The standard quantity that's shown to me is 30. Now, this is where I use my good old-fashioned common sense. 30 does not compare to 1,615,000. This is 30 pounds per unit. I have to multiply this 30 times the actual number of units produced during the period. That was in that sentence I told you to underline. So we're going to multiply that 30 times 54,000 units. And when we do that multiplication, we should come out to 1,620,000. Now, if you look at the the first green table on page 905, that first green table on page 905 tells me that quantity that we just calculated, 1,620,000. But I wanted you to see where that number came from, because not every problem will give you this detail. You take the number of pounds per unit in terms of standard quantity and multiply it times the actual number of units produced. Now let's fill in our table here. We have the actual price of 410. That will be multiplied times the actual quantity of 1615. And then we have the standard price of 4 multiplied times the actual quantity of 1615 again. And then we have the standard price of 4 multiplied by the standard quantity of 1620. Now, I can look at this ahead of time, and I know right now that right now, in terms of just looking at this table here, that I spent more than what I planned to spend. I also know that I used less than what I plan to use. So I'm expecting an unfavorable variance for price. I'm expecting a favorable variance for quantity. Now let's fill in these numbers. So when we multiply everything out, remember, you don't have to put the minus here. Sometimes it's helpful. This minus this, and then this number minus this number, so that we can take our positives and negatives as they are. Here I get a positive number. It is unfavorable. And here I get a negative number because this is favorable. So the 161,500 is my price. And the 20,000 is my quantity. Now let's do this same thing with labor. I'm trying to erase nice and neat. But with labor, we're going to fill in what's missing. Instead of getting price and quantity variances, I am going to get rate and efficiency variances. But they mean the same thing in terms of P's and Q's. Oh, I erased too much here, of course. No, I didn't erase enough. So for labor, and pulling out my numbers, again, looking at the second green table on page 905, looking at the direct labor information, I can find my actual price of $13.75. I can find my actual quantity of 265,000 hours. For my standards, I can go back to my original green table on the previous page and look in parentheses and see that I plan to pay $14 per hour. And I have a standard quantity of 5. That 5 does not compare to that 265. So I need to multiply that times the actual number of units produced, which was given to me in the problem of 54,000, giving me a standard quantity of 270,000. If you look in the green table on page 905, that first green table on 905, you'll see that 270,000 hours right there for you. Again, not every problem will show it to you that way. So remember to take this additional step for standard quantity. When we fill all this stuff in on our table here, and we take the 1375 times the actual quantity of 265. And we fill in our big numbers, because these are some big numbers. 643,750. how we find our differences. I forgot to do my common sense check because I wanted to see here. I planned to pay 14 and I ended up paying $13.75 an hour. I'm happy about that. I planned for them to take 270,000 and they actually took 265, so less than that. I'm happy about that too. So those are favorable variances. And this one is my rate variance and this one is my efficiency variance. Now, let's do one that we haven't done because I didn't spend a lot of time with variable and fixed overhead, primarily because the problem on the exam does not cover variable and fixed. I think I may ask that as an extra credit question, but on the problem portion of the exam, you will be asked to compute materials variances and labor variances. Of course, to find the overall variances, I would be combining those two. But let's do variable overhead just for the fun of it. All right, so for variable overhead, again, it looks very similar to materials, very similar to labor. And I'm pulling my numbers from the same places. Now, it's good that we're doing this because sometimes actual price and actual quantity are not given to me separately. I think in this one, they are nice enough to give it to me, but not explicitly. Now, it looks like variable overhead is based on labor hours. So my actual hours here for a factory overhead are the same as my labor hours. My actual price is not given to me for variable overhead, and that's okay because I have the final number here. I have the 2,200. So AP times AQ, 2.2 million, sorry. That number comes from the second table on page 905, where it says variable factory overhead. So sometimes you won't be given separately actual price times actual quantity. And that's okay because you don't need actual price because you have the resulting figure. I do need actual quantity and I need standard price and standard quantity. So let's fill in those. For my standard price, it is 8, and that comes from that first table on page 904 at the beginning of the problem. And my standard quantity is 5. I know that this 5 does not compare to this 200 and, excuse me, I had the wrong number here for actual labor hours. It should be 265. Picked up the wrong number. That 265 does not compare to this 5. So I have to take that 5 and multiply it times the actual number of units produced. And when I do that, that is where I get the 270,000. Now, let's fill in our table. I have my 2.2 million here. I'm going to take my standard price of 8, and I'm going to multiply it times my actual quantity of 265. Now, I'm going to take that standard price of 8 again and multiply it times the standard quantity of 270. Now, you might be wondering, why is she using the same hours or the same numbers as direct labor? Because variable overhead is based on direct labor hours. So that's why I'm using the same numbers for direct labor hours when it comes to actual quantity and standard quantity. Now, let's multiply all this stuff out. 2120, and then this one should be 2160. And when we do our subtraction, this one is 80,000 unfavorable because it's positive. And this one is 40,000 favorable. Now, when it comes to the overhead variances, we have a spending variance and we have efficiency. Let's see if I can spell. Efficiency variance. We can combine those two and that gives us the overall variable overhead variance. Now, last one we have to do is for fixed overhead. And I think fixed overhead is my favorite. I like doing the variable overhead variances in labor and materials. But once you do it once, it's like, okay, we're doing the same thing over and over again. Let's do something new. And fixed overhead gives me that variety that is the spice of life that I need every now and then. So with fixed overhead, our numbers change, or our categories, our headings change, because now we take actual versus budget versus applied. And applied is just standard price times our standard quantity. So that makes life a little bit easier there. So for the actual numbers for fixed overhead, I take the numbers given to me exactly from the problem. So that 22,350,000 is there. 2350. The budgeted number comes directly from the very first table on page 905. This is the first time I've used this table. I have not used this table, but this is where I find budgeted overhead. It is the true budgeted amount. And again, it's based on 90% of capacity. Now, the applied number requires me to look at my very first table here. And my very first table in the problem for fixed factory overhead, the standard price is 10. And the standard quantity, again, is that 5, but it's the 5 multiplied by the 54,000 units produced. So when we kept doing that, we kept getting 270,000. Let me put a little star by that so you know where I got that from. That's the 5 times the 54,000 units. And that gives me the 270,000. So of course that's 2.7 million. So now let's find our variances here. We're still subtracting this minus this, and then this minus this. Here I have a $50,000 favorable variance, that's called spending. And here I have a $300,000 favorable volume variance. This variance only happens because the number of units I produced, the way I calculated that number is different from the way I calculated my budgeted figure. This really has nothing to do with me being efficient or inefficient. It's just a difference in terms of how many I produce versus how many I plan to produce. And usually we find our fixed factory overhead rate based on 80% of the productive capacity, or 60,000 units. That's what the problem told us. So how we calculate the budgeted number can be different from how we apply it, because how we apply it is based on the actual number of units produced. But our predetermined overhead numbers here are based on 80%, but we produced at 90%.